Well, as I mentioned earlier, today's gathering is a special one because we're honoring the Teaneck International Film Festival, known as TIFF, T-I-F-F, for its work to creating spaces for narratives that highlight the different and distinct voices of our American culture. And we'll be awarding TIFF a humanitarian award. And I will explain that a bit later, and also we'll do the award at the end. But first, we're going to invite Jeremy Lentz, Executive Director of the Teaneck Film Festival, to come up and have a seat, and also Richard Koszarski to come up. Richard is a film historian, and I'll remind them both to turn their microphones on. And if you guys will have a seat. I'm going to work seated also. So Jeremy has been the executive director of TIFF for 15 years and helped develop its forever theme, activism, making change. Under Jeremy's direction, TIFF has been dubbed by the Star Ledger as the film festival with a social conscience and is now considered one of the most prominent social justice film festivals in the nation. And when he isn't leading and a meeting with the TIFF team, he may be found at work as director of Lentz & Lentz SAT prep or producing Broadway shows. And Richard Bernstein, who is a longtime friend of the Society and is married to Diane Koszarski. Did I say Richard Bernstein?
Yes.
Richard Koszarski.
He's a friend too, though.
He's a long, right? Well, Richard Koszarski is Professor Emeritus of English and Film at Rutgers University, the former curator at the American Museum of the Moving Image, and currently the curator of the Barrymore Film Center in Fort Lee. Then we will have time for Q&A later. And at the end, as I say, I'll award the Jack Rubenstein Award. So first, let's talk to Jeremy. Can you give us a bit of the history of TIFF, when it started, why it started, and who started it?
Yeah, so the film festival was founded 18 years ago, probably 18 plus years ago, by two incredible women who are here today. Ellen Rand, the former executive director, and Judy Disler, who is still a very active member of the festival. I know it all started on a treadmill at Glen Point. Right, that's the folklore. Teaneck needed a film festival, and Judy and Ellen went to the Puffin Foundation and asked for the seed money, and the foundation provided that. And we have since been a project of the Puffin Foundation. For those of you who don't know, the Puffin Foundation, they're a national foundation that's headquartered here in Teaneck, and they provide grant funding to artists who are marginalized based on race, gender, religion, political ideology, orientation, et cetera, et cetera. So over the years, what we did when I took over the film festival was to really fuse the mission of the foundation with the unique history of Teaneck being the first township in the United States to vote to voluntarily desegregate. And that really has given us a niche in the film festival world in terms of the types of films that we show that engage our community, bring in various different organizations, and showcase films that are really talking about the important issues that we need to be aware of, not only locally in our community, nationally, and internationally, as I'm sure many of you have seen over our 18-year history. So.
Yeah, you know, Jeremy mentioned the Puffin. I also want to mention the Puffin supports the Ethical Society. We got a grant for them for our recent Church State series, and also a grant for them for the Great New Jersey Science Show, which began last night. So we're indebted to the Puffin Foundation as well. So now, when is the next series coming up for TIFF?
Right, so the next film festival will be celebrated November 5th to the 12th this year. Tickets go on sale 1 month in advance, so about October 5th, tickets will be on sale online. And we're currently also in the process of finishing our, I think it's our 4th Independent Lens series. That's a winter doc series that we do in partnership with PBS, and we premiere documentary films that are about community. And we're ending April, I believe it's Wednesday, April 19th, with Free Chol-Soo Lee, which is a documentary about a Korean immigrant who is wrongly incarcerated for killing in San Francisco's Chinatown. And he's mistaken for being Chinese when he's Korean. And it's a fascinating story for any of you who have maybe seen the Central Park Five and know about that story. There's a lot of parallels to that, and it sparked this Asian solidarity movement to free him over decades. And it's a really fascinating story, and we'll have the filmmakers there. It's a free screening, it's virtual, so anyone can tune in anywhere in the country. So I would encourage people, just sign up. That's all you have to do. Go to the website, teaneckfilmfestival.org, and you can register for that screening.
And we'll come back to that, because that's a very interesting, the tie-in with PBS and Indie Lens is a very interesting one, and I want to come back to that. I should mention also that this society has co-sponsored several films with TIFF, including last year we co-sponsored Julia Scotti, Funny That Way, about a trans comedian, Julia Scotti. As one of the Indie Lens features, we co-sponsored Coded Bias in 2021, which is about the use of artificial intelligence and facial recognition, the use of that by police departments. That was really terrific. I did the talk back to that, and we had the New Jersey Attorney General on the talk back. That was really great. And another one that we sponsored in 2018 was An Act of Defiance, which is a feature film, not a documentary, about the Ravonia trial in South Africa. This was the trial that led to the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. But let's talk about some other recent films that TIFF did. So one of them was a really great film about reproductive rights, If These Walls Could Talk. If you want to say something about that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so we did a legacy screening this past year for If These Walls Could Talk, which was an HBO feature. It was co-produced by Demi Moore's production company, and it was co-directed by Cher and Nancy Savoca. And
what do you mean a legacy fee?
Meaning that this film originally premiered, it was over 20 years ago. And occasionally we bring back older films that we feel are really relevant to the issues today, to educate new audiences and to show it to audiences who may have not seen it. And we chose that film because of what happened with Roe v. Wade and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And what we felt was so important, every year TIFF has been involved in the process of trying to educate people on how Roe v. Wade and the rights, women's reproductive rights, were being stripped away. So what happened in the court hearing was really not a surprise to us. The writing was on the wall, and for people who have attended year after year, the speakers that we've had, they've all been kind of screaming that, you know, this is happening, states are chipping away at the law. But we never really found a narrative feature that could really frame the story that well. And what was so unique about If These Walls Could Talk was it takes one suburban house, and the home of that house is showcased in kind of three different vignettes in different periods in American history. So one is around World War II, the other is in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement. And then the third one is more present day, takes place in a Planned Parenthood clinic. And it follows the story of the three women who live in that house, and each of those women and their families' experience with abortion. And it's really, I think, a film that raises all questions and tells each story very uniquely about perspective on women's reproductive rights. So we felt that that was a really important film to bring back. And we were so lucky to get Nancy Savoca, the co-director, who's now a professor at University of Michigan, to be involved with the screening. And, you know, one of the things that she had said was the importance, I mean, sadly, that we have to revive films like this and have to continue to have these conversations today, when we thought, you know, Roe v. Wade was a settled issue. But again, I think much of the work that we do is also bringing these stories to new generations, especially folks that don't know what this country was like pre-Roe v. Wade and are now experiencing that depending on what state they live in.
And, you know, as Jeremy mentioned, we had a talk back with the producer as well as several other people. And I can tell you, we have talkbacks. I think now we have, I say we, by the way, because I'm actually part of TIFF. I'm one of the film screeners who helps select the movies. And I've also moderated some of the talkbacks.
Yeah.
But I think now we're doing talkbacks on almost every live film that we present at a theater, right?
Yeah.
And we present at the Teaneck Cinemas, Puffin
Cultural Forum, Temple Emeth. We also do a youth series at Teaneck High School, which Dina Grushkin's here. She helps curate that and initiate that. We get every single high school student at Teaneck High School engaged and involved on a film that the students help to pick out. And then we have a panel discussion and they get a curriculum that's onboarded in the classroom. So that's been really effective to kind of get our kids active and involved and hopefully engaged on important issues.
And one of the other films we did last year was A Story of Bones, which was really unique and told a story that I was certainly totally, I think everyone who saw it was unaware of this story. You want to mention it?
Yeah, there's so many incredible local stories, and what's so unique about living in Teaneck, being a part of this community, is that we get to realize how many connections there are locally to Teaneck, people who have come out of this community, people who live here. And A Story of Bones came to us because it premiered at Tribeca, and the woman who was the impact producer, a woman by the name of Peggy King Your Day, is an Englewood resident. She formerly lived in Manhattan, but she was involved in the enslaved African memorial when they were excavating to put up a tower in Lower Manhattan. They found a burial ground of African American remains, slave remains, and she basically petitioned the city on preservation and halted development and got the city involved with the developer and said, this is our unique history and this has to be preserved, and effectively started a movement. And that was during the Dinkins administration. And then flash forward to present day, there's an island, a British island, that's inhabited by 40,000 people, same population as Teaneck, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean between Africa and the Americas. Is called St. Helena. And it was a stopping point in the Middle Passage on the slave trade. And recently, within the last 10 years, the British government decided that they were going to build an airport, because prior to that, that island was only accessible through boat. And in the construction of building the airport, they uncovered the largest remains of the slave trade to date. And the woman who was working on that project was from Namibia, and she petitioned British government to halt the construction for the airport. And ultimately, they were met with a lot of pushback, and she needed help because she said, if you know, how we preserve our dead, that's in many ways revolutionary. And the British government was, you know, they were met with a lot of resistance about that. So this woman in Namibia finds Peggy King Your Day, reads about what she did in New York City, and calls this woman and says to her, I need your help. What you did in New York, we need to do that here. And this woman flies to this island, not knowing this other woman, and these two women unite to effectively preserve the dead and preserve the bones of the dead, and want to start a global revolution in terms of holding our governments accountable. Because as much as this is a part of African history, a part of UK history, a part of American history, we're all intertwined in that. And she documented this story, which is still a work in progress. And you know, what was interesting about that island. It was where Napoleon Bonaparte
That's right.
died, and you go to that island and you see all of, the kind of grandeur that they have to this awful person, but yet when it came to preserving and telling the history of the Middle Passage and the slave trade, that all of a sudden became controversial. So we were really blessed to be given that film for its second international premiere. Even prior to UK, it was a UK production, and have Peggy come out here and speak, and have the filmmakers, which were based in the UK, provide their thanks for showing the film. And again, the stories that we know, and having our local historians, because people don't know, right here in Teaneck, there's, the burial ground, and just knowing our history, linking our history to global history. That's what the film festival is really about, in telling these stories.
Right. And, of course, I think most people, if they knew St. Helena at all, it's because that was Napoleon's second exile,
Right.
the one that he couldn't escape from. I want to mention also when we screened the Central Park 5, which was a really extraordinary and extraordinarily timely documentary. And we were fortunate enough to have two of the now adults, but at that time kids, who were convicted and then later exonerated, Corey Weiss and Kevin Richardson.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. Over the years, 18-year history, when we're interviewed, I'm always asked, what are the films that stand out? And there's so many. We've had the most incredible stories here. But for me personally, the Central Park 5 is one that just always kind of pierces in my mind. And the story was such a unique story, in the sense that we worked with the Innocence Project in order to get that film out here and get the co-directors. And for those of you who don't know the work that the Innocence Project does, they work with inmates that are incarcerated or wrongly incarcerated, that are then released, and work to rehabilitate them into society and get them speaking engagements and such. So the Central Park 5 was a story that I grew up with. I mean, I was in high school when that happened, but I remember that case, and I remember the fear that was brought up by what happened. And what was so unique about that story was we knew about the 5 and the trial, but we really didn't hear much about their exoneration, and that these guys were wrongly incarcerated, and that they had to go up against the city of New York and fight this for decades. And under the Giuliani administration, there was no settlement. Under the Bloomberg administration, there was no settlement. And one of the really good things I think that Bill de Blasio did, and that he ran on, was getting the Central Park 5 to finally have a settlement with the city of New York. But that film, in the context that we showed it, was also kind of at the time when Trump was first announcing his candidacy for president. And what was so awful about that case was that he was, back then, one of the key kind of proponents, or the key people who really were, he took out a full-page ad in the Times about, them being guilty, and that they need to be tried and hung and all of that. And then years after, and this was all New York Police Department, the prosecutor's office, everything that was associated with that case, when they got exonerated, they never admitted, like Trump would never acknowledge their wrongdoing. Same thing with the prosecutor, Linda Fairstein. Many of you may know her as a New York Times bestselling crime novelist. She left her job with the city of New York after that case, and has been making millions upon millions of dollars writing fictional crime novels, and again, never acknowledged any wrongdoing in that case, which is pretty remarkable that these people have gone on to have careers. And then when he runs for president, he stirs the pot again after these guys are trying to get their lives in order and just kind of function in a society after what they've been through. and again, raises these questions that they were guilty, and that, the whole thing starts over again, and then it's linked to all the racism. But in terms of working with the two of the Central Park Five, Corey and Kevin, who came out here, and just being able to listen to their story and hear what they went through, and understand that, the system is really corrupt, and there's a lot that is wrong, from police department to the political system, from the bottom on up. And it was eye-opening, and really important story, and a film that's obviously become really relevant today, with HBO making it into a feature presentation after the doc.
I think that was one of the most moving talkbacks.
we
I
ever had.
I was just in the audience for that, right?
Yeah,
Seeing Corey and Kevin, as well as the co-director, David McMahon.
right.
It was really a
David
moving.
McMahon, yeah, and Ken Burns, who co-directed it, who didn't join us. And speaking of Corey, one of the interesting things, just to speak to who these people were, when the city of New York finally gave them the settlement, Corey Wise took that money and donated it to school in the Midwest, law school, that they renamed after him.
Didn't know that.
It's pretty remarkable. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about one other film that we showed in 2019, but I'm going to ask you to just mention it, just talk a little bit about how we showed it, but then I'm going to actually use that as a segue to have Richard talk in more detail about it, as well as some other films. And that film is Be Natural, The Untold Story of Alice Guy Blaché, which TIFF showed in 2019. Can you just tell us how we came to that film? And
Yeah. Wow. It's interesting. How did we come to that film? The history of the film, Fort Lee, at the time, Fort Lee Film Commission was in place, which is now converted to Barrymore Film Center. Jodie Foster and Pamela Green produced this film about the history of filmmaking in the United States, which told the story of a French filmmaker called Alice Guy Blaché at the turn of the century, who came here and founded one of the first film studios, and told the story of how Hollywood was essentially, before it moved out to California, it was right here in our backyard in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And Pamela Green, who was the director, this was really a labor of love. The amount of archival footage that she had to dig up and get the rights for that film in order to tell that story was just remarkable. And Jodie Foster was a producer on the film. She also narrated it, and we were so lucky that year to have them come out here, and we were able to give Jodie and Pamela an honor. And a former executive director of the Film Center was involved with the talk back with Senator Weinberg on that film. But really, again, telling our history and seeing how much our community has impacted the world, not just on social issues, but in entertainment and the arts, and preserving that and being able to tell that story was so much fun. And to have Jodie Foster out here was really exciting for a lot of people.
And I'd like to turn to Richard now. So Richard, as I mentioned, is a film historian, and he's actually one of the experts that was interviewed in this film about Alice Guy Blaché. So Richard, can you tell us more about that film and how that, and who she was? And we'll go from there.
Before we do that, if this were an academic, it's a lot of echo here, no? If this were an academic conference, I would be the respondent on here, right? So I'd listen to this great presentation, then I'd have something to add to it. And I do have something to add, because what you've heard is how important the programming decisions, the curated programming decisions of the Teaneck Film Festival are and have been, right? And you might think, well, that's a passive thing. People make films, and Teaneck Film Festival is good. They show some of the best films. But let me tell you that almost all commercial, in any sense, motion picture production is driven by the audience, which means it's driven by the venues. There have to be theaters or showcases or festivals that exist that want films to be made. They want something to come in to show them. And if there was no demand on the part of forces like the Teaneck Film Festival, those films wouldn't be shown. Other films would be made. Right? People with the money and the resources and the interest to make movies would say, well, there's demand over here. We'll address that demand. We'll address that demand. Now, you and I were talking the other day, not just about Alice Guy Blaché and the studios in Fort Lee. And I said, yes, they flourished for about 10 years, 10, 12 years, maybe in the early silent days before they decided it was cheaper to make films in Hollywood. And the reason they went to Hollywood was because California, and this is a Teaneck Film Festival point. Hollywood, California it's a open shop town. So the bulk cost of making movies went into salaries. It went into carpenters, teamsters, electricians, painters, and those wages were way lower than in New York and New Jersey. So they tell you, oh, they went out because of the sunshine. It wasn't because of the sunshine. They already had studios with electric lights. That's what they were working at. It's just that the carpenters, the electricians, everybody else were making a fraction of what, and they weren't unionized either. So you weren't going to have them causing any kind of union difficulty. So that's why the industry left New York and New Jersey completely in the late teens and almost completely by the early 1920s. So they had built these studios in Fort Lee. Their Alice Blaché's studio was on Lemoyne Avenue, and there were other studios along Main Street and off Main Street in Fort Lee. And in the mid-1920s, these were derelict. I mean, not only was this bad for the tax base in Fort Lee, but it was just, they were what do you call an attractive nuisance. You know, every kid with a rock, because they had glass roofs and walls. Every kid with a rock would go in there and, you know, try to break a pane of glass. And even today, people come to me and they say, oh, I remember going into those abandoned studios. They had old films in there. So old films. So yeah, we take those old films and, you know, they were inflammable. So we take a reel of film and we'd, you know, hold one end of it and throw it down the street, roll it down the street and light a match to one end and it would go whoosh down and kaboom. And I said, that's one reason why all those old films are gone today. Huh? Yeah. A lot of empty buildings, deserted industrial buildings in the middle of Fort Lee, and there wasn't much you could do about it. And then the Depression comes and the economy changes. So that situation existed really until the 60s before they were able to clear that out of the way. However, there is a use for them that pops up in the late 1920s and the early 30s. That's when sound pictures come in, right? There were a couple of different sound systems. Western Electric, the phone company, they had a sound system, and RCA had a sound system. And all of these sound systems, Westinghouse had a sound system, and all of these real, you know, high-tech sound systems were signed up by the major studios, Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount. If you were an independent person who wanted to make a movie and it was going to be a sound movie, where could you go? There were a lot of independent silent movies. African-American producers were making silent movies, but in silent movie days, all you needed was a loft or with a few lights or a backyard or a location. Once sound films came in, you needed a proper studio that was soundproofed. You needed a lot of electronics. This cost money. This cost a lot of money. And it also meant that you had to have access to certain levels of technology, which even if you could pay for them, may not have been available because we're signed up with Warner Brothers. You know, we're signed up with the Fox company. That is where these studios in Fort Lee came in a very interesting way to help filmmakers that we describe as marginalized filmmakers, such as Oscar Michaud, African-American filmmaker who had been making what they called race movies for African-American audiences for a decade, almost a decade. And Michaud has to make sound films. Now, where is he going to get access to sound recording equipment? Well, you had these empty studios, empty stages. They were still there, a little dusty, but you could clean them out. And there were other people who had almost do-it-yourself sound systems, Powers Cinephone system or whatever. Many of these systems, and they worked. Maybe they didn't work as well as Western Electric system, but they worked, and you could make a film that could be shown in a commercial theater. So there's a moment in Fort Lee, 1929, 30, 31, where the abandoned studios suddenly come to life. There's a lot of work going on in there, and people are wiring them, and investment is going into these studios. And who makes those movies? It's not Paramount, not MGM or Warner Brothers. They have their own studios. They're looking around and they're saying, who wants to make films but actually can't for one reason or another? Right? Either they're purposely excluded or that financially they can't meet this threshold. Remember that the American studio system by that point is what you call an oligopoly. That is, it's not a monopoly with one company. It's a series of very friendly, vertically integrated companies that own their factory, which is a studio. They own their distribution network, and they own their studios. Right. So Fox had the Fox studio, they had Fox distribution, and they had Fox theaters. And Paramount had the same thing, and MGM had the same thing. And the theaters existed to play the movies that are being made by the studios. Now, that doesn't mean that a Lowe's theater always showed an MGM film, because sometimes they wanted the Paramount film, so they would trade back and forth. But if you were on the outside of that oligopoly, if you were, say, Howard Hughes, the billionaire who said, I've got money, I've made films, now who wants to show them? People say, not us. Or they might say, well, what's it worth to you if we show your film? So people like Hughes would say, well, you're preventing me, an independent person, from having access. This becomes a long, complicated legal thing. But it's not just a billionaire like Howard Hughes, it's everybody else who is excluded, including people like Oscar Micheaux, right? Oscar Micheaux doesn't have automatic access to the Warner theater chain or the Lowe's theater chain, but there have been theaters in African-American communities, some of them owned by African-American entrepreneurs, others just theaters that happen to exist there in Texas or Virginia or Detroit, Chicago, or around New York City. And there they want to get films from, in Michaud's case, African-American producer and African-American perspective. Well, when sound comes in, not only does Michaud want to make films, but other people suddenly realize they want to make films as well, like Italian-Americans. Italians. Italy is not making films yet, right? They don't have sound equipment for commercial films in Italy. So some of the first Italian language films are made in New Jersey by Italian-American theater companies, one of them based in Newark. They're looking around, and where can I make a film? Well, they've just reopened those old 10-year-old studios in Fort Lee with sound equipment. So we'll make a sound film over there. So you find Italian language films are made there, Yiddish films. Very famously, most of the American Yiddish films are made in New York City and New Jersey, and they're made in these sort of second-tier independent studios, right? And where do they go? Well, they go to theaters that happen to be in neighborhoods, areas where you have a large Yiddish-speaking population, and that Yiddish-speaking population is creating demand. Somebody thinks there's demand over there. So the theaters surrounding in those areas say, well, somebody needs to provide us films. So suddenly there's a demand for this kind of film to be produced to reach this population that was previously ignored or marginalized. I did a lot of research on this part of Fort Lee's history. And while there were a few sort of conventional, B movies made there in the early sound period, most of the films were they were race movies, Yiddish pictures, Italian. The first Serbo-Croatian talkie was made in Cliffside Park in the studio. And believe me, I would go to these I would, oh, wait, we'll get to that. I mean, I would go to these film festivals, and the guy from the Zagreb Film Archive would always come up to me and he said, have you found the film yet? You know, which was the great first lost Serbo-Croatian talkie. He said, no, we don't have it yet. You know, he said, well, I'm looking for it too. You know, I found these other things. And then there's another group that isn't being addressed in Hollywood, the Mormons. So actually, it was right after Michaud makes his first two films in the World Studio in Fort Lee. A group from Salt Lake City came out, and they had a lot of money, and they said, we want to make a biblical film from a story out of the Book of Mormon. So they make a film called Corianton, which is it's apparently a chapter from the Book of Mormon, and it's set in the Mormon biblical days in the New World. So they built these wonderful sets, these kind of like Aztec biblical inspired sets. And, you know, they make this biblical epic, which they were looking at DeMille's film, King of Kings. And they said, okay, well, he made King of Kings for them, and we're going to make Corianton. It didn't get a lot of distribution because apparently it was made by the wrong Mormons or something in the wrong way. There was some problem inside that community. But although I've seen that film, it's quite an interesting independent film. So all this comes back to the fact that all these worthy films, and you have a lot of nonfiction films, but you're also exhibiting fictional films. The demand from them has to come from somewhere. And if you have a viable way of voicing that demand and saying it, we're people over here, we want a film, you know, we want a film for our Mormon story, who's going to make it for us? Or we want an Italian language film because they're not coming over from Italy yet. That's what sort of greases this wheel, because it always requires money. You know, none of this stuff is going to happen without some money changing hands. And then more of these good things happen. And as that demand disappears, it's no longer addressed. And so that's why it's important for you to keep pressing on the demand for these kind of films. Yes, here's a venue, and we're partnering with these other organizations, and give us more of those films.
You know, I want to just show people some of what Richard's talking about in terms of Fort Lee, and also about this film about Alice Guy Blaché, and ask Jeremy to talk about her a bit. Peter, I'm going to ask our Zoom coordinator, Peter Kasturis, to share his screen and show two pictures. So Alice Guy Blaché, correct me if I'm wrong, was a Black French woman.
White.
What?
No.
She wasn't black.
She wasn't Black?
No, that would have been remarkable.
Oh, well,
If he had been,
I must have been asleep the day we
it's
shot.
enough to be the first woman,
Right.
filmmaker. And
Oscar Michaud was
yeah,
black.
that's
Right,
Oscars.
sorry, okay.
Yeah.
Peter, you want to show the first one first?
Here it is.
The one with the studio, I mean.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so this is a picture of her building when it was being built, Solax Studio in 1912.
And she's sitting down.
Yeah,
She's not standing because she's like 7 months pregnant at this point, but she's supervising the building of the studio, but she's got, okay, I'm going to sit while you take this picture.
okay, now go to the map
Okay.
to show you where this is from. Now, where it is currently, the location. So you can see it's off Lemoyne, near where the Acme Market is, off near Bridge Plaza. So that's the area we're talking about for that
Yeah,
studio.
it's just south of the high school, and it's the parking lot of the supermarket.
So this documentary was really a terrific documentary, and it was. You want to tell us a little bit about how that got produced and?
Yeah, I think the one thing to kind of keep in mind is put it in perspective. Turn of the century, a woman is spearheading a film company here in the United States. And, at a time when women didn't even have a right to vote, right? And this woman is creating these opportunities and this new art form here, which is so remarkable. And also to put in context, Oscar Michaud, for those of you who don't know, Oscar Michaud to this day, and correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, I think is the most prolific African-American, has made the most directed films of any African-American director are still Oscar Michaud holds that record.
Certainly for the length of his career.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was making films at the turn of the century. We did a film many years ago back at Holy Name, a preview of a film called Oscar's Comeback. And the couple that worked on that film just now is getting that release, which they have hours upon hours upon hours of footage, but really ties in his story with where we are today. And it focuses on a film festival in the Midwest, a film and book festival that was dedicated to him, and what kind of happened to that festival as a result of the changing politics in this country. But to get back to Alice Guy Blaché, yeah, I mean, effectively, she was a pioneer in the film world and came out here and created one of the first studios and was effectively, responsible for the state of films that we have today.
Now, David, actually, when you said, is she African American, I thought you were going to point out this one film that she made called A Fool and His Money, which is the first all-black cast, fictional film released by an American studio. And she apparently it's adapted from a vaudeville skit that toured the black vaudeville circuit, and it's not full of caricatures. It's a comedy film, but it's very sort of respectable, sensible film. And that picture went out, and it had really been lost even to historic memory until recently. And it turned up, and it's quite a remarkable film. And that film is made years before even Oscar Michaud starts making movies.
Yeah.
I wish that is what I was gonna refer to, but it was just my confusion.
Fool and His Money. Yeah. Okay.
But I think what's so interesting to that point, where we are today, is a lot of this stuff is just being uncovered, and these stories are being told now. And now we have the Barrymore Film Center that just opened this year in Fort Lee, that has a museum and is telling that history that will be there forever. But what we've also seen as a result of Governor Murphy passing the film tax credit is a huge amount of film production that is now finally taking place in New Jersey. Under Christie administration wouldn't allow that. And just to kind of speak to that, just in Teaneck alone, Armageddon Time was filmed right up the street with Anthony Hopkins, as well as Bros, which was the first studio film that was all LGBTQ written and themed. They shot some of it right here in Teaneck Cinemas. Julia Scotti actually had a cameo in it, for those of you who saw it. The Joker 2 is being shot here right now with Lady Gaga. But what it's doing is, number one, I think understanding that, because where we're situated obviously is important in getting the crews out here, but also New Jersey is so versatile as far as city and country and hills and beaches. They're all kind of different areas for filmmakers to want to come and produce. And just to give an anecdotal story, Larry Scher, whose parents are on our programming committee, Joan and Paul Scher, many of you may know, that used to live in Teaneck. They're now on the West Coast. Their son was the DP of the Hangover movies, DP like cinematographer, director of photography. And he, has since gone on to direct things, but he's also involved in the Joker films. And he directed his first film with Glenn Close and Ving Rhames and Christopher Walken. And he wanted to shoot the film in Teaneck because he wanted to find streets that resembled what he knew growing up, which were these Tudor-style tree-lined homes. And it was his ideal to come and shoot here, but the studio dictates where you go based on cost. So they told him, no, you have to shoot in Atlanta. And they went to Atlanta and scouted to find a community, a suburban community that somewhat resembled Teaneck. But now that we do have a tax credit, if Rose was made today, I'm sure he probably would have been able to do that in Teaneck. So it's interesting, just as far as seeing, the preservation of our history, putting spotlight on that, allowing film festivals like ours to have that, place where we can be the voice of showing these films and provide the demand, and also understand our community and show not only educate, but show our audiences what we feel they want to see. And I think it's been a testament. And when filmmakers come out here, what they're so struck by is how a suburban community 5 miles outside of Manhattan has been able to support an international film festival for 18 years, and how it thrives, and the audiences and the numbers that we get who come out. And that's a testament, I think, to who we are, as a community. And that's what TIFF does. We create community.
And I want to leave time for questions, but from the audience, but I want to talk about the whole PBS tie-in that occurred
Mhm.
during COVID. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the Puffin Foundation, which funds so many projects throughout this country, and many you'll never hear of, but they came to us right before COVID and said PBS is effectively starting this program with their Independent Lens division, and Indie Lens is the division where they produce documentaries that are totally in line with the work that we do, social commentary, social justice causes. And we started this partnership pre-COVID to showcase these films. And the catalyst for that was because of Netflix and all the streaming avenues. PBS felt that they were losing their viewer base, and their viewer base skews much older. So what they wanted to do was to engage community and showcase their films and bring in different demographics to have these premieres before they actually showed them on their channel, on channel 13, as a way of building an audience and integrating that with their app and trying to bring in new demographics through community. And they felt that we were a perfect community partner in that, which we were. And we showed our first film, which was called Rainbow Coalition. And then COVID happened. And pretty much almost immediately, Eating Up Easter was the film that we transitioned over, about Easter Island. We were able to transition to this virtual platform. And what that enabled us to do for the last 2.5 years was effectively now bring in this entire new audience by having virtual screenings and being partnered with PBS National, that's based in San Francisco, to build our audience and tell these stories, but now tell them anywhere in the country. So that really, I think, in many ways has repurposed the festival and broadened our reach. And we continue, as we go back to our in-person venues, to also keep the virtual component alive and do the series online, and have our festival have a hybrid model where people can participate from all other parts of the country. Because I think the work in what we're doing is really now what's become the driving force. And with all the changes that we've seen with who's telling our stories and how our stories are being told, the importance in the work that we do has just become so much more heightened. And there was a time where I think we felt that we were good. We could kind of rest on our laurels and maybe just, let it go by the wayside. And then, with the shifts that happened in 2016, we were like, no, this is, if our voice is silenced, this is just another voice that's getting silenced, that the opposition wants to happen, and really providing a space for safe spaces to tell these stories, to bring in marginalized groups, to be the voice for marginalized communities, and to educate people and bring people together so that they can talk and have open and honest conversations and hopefully learn about their neighbors. That's how you make change, and that's how you make positive change, not functioning in various echo chambers or on tweets or on a 30-second social media reel or a soundbite. It's really about bringing in conversations and creating safe spaces. And that's what we continue to do. And that's really the driving force for all the people that volunteer, and like you, David, and all the people that are here are part of the committee. We do what we do because it's so important to our future.
And I should explain this streaming platform, unlike Netflix or Amazon, everyone watches the same thing together at the same time. So we retain the communal experience, not like Netflix where you say, it's 3 a.m. I can't sleep. I want to play this. And there's and of course, when we do it, there's also a talk back afterwards, with the we being TIFF here. So I'd like to open this up for any questions. Yes, Jim Norman, our president, has a question.
First of all, I want to thank both of our guests. What a terrific talk from two different perspectives that actually come together very nicely. So thank you. So my question is, I'm wondering what enticed filmmakers, these initial filmmakers, to come to Fort Lee in the first place? And I'm wondering if it maybe was proximity to New York and to the pictorially exciting geographical feature of the Palisades, or what was it that brought them to Fort Lee in the first place? And are there any remnants of any of the studios or shooting venues that can be seen today if someone wants to take a walking tour?
Well, the answer to the first question is, so the studios had their main offices in New York, right, Manhattan. And there were some down in Philadelphia, in Manhattan. So they're down in East 14th Street or West 18th Street. You can only do so much exterior shooting there. It's very difficult they didn't know how to control crowds on the street, whatever. So you can't go south, that's the Bay. East is sort of boring. On Long Island, it's very flat. You could go north and get something, but if you cross the river, not only do you have these Palisades and you have the river as well, but the geographical shape of Fort Lee that encouraged George Washington to build a fort there, mainly it was very hard to get to. Right. It didn't slow the British down too much, but it did slow down development, so that the development south of Fort Lee in New Jersey, it was very rapid and quite a lot of turnover. Fort Lee in 1910 still looked like the middle of the 19th century. I mean, there was one downtown with a bunch of resort hotels and one sort of tenement style building. And then the rest of it was 19th century farmhouses and fields. And if you went a little bit further, there are nice lakes and waterfalls. You could rent horses, and Fort Lee was used to accommodating day trippers. It would be like going out to the Hamptons or so. People would go out, they'd spend maybe even a day or a couple nights in Fort Lee in a B&B, you'd ride horses around. So the people in the town were used to accommodating that, where other people, they used to try to film like in other parts of New Jersey, and the residents weren't used to accommodating these peculiar people from New York who wanted to. I said, can you give me a location where there's like horses with a stable next to a church or something? They'd say, please get out of here. So that was good. And for a while, the people in Fort Lee welcomed that because the hotel business was declining. But then they started to build too many studios, and it was sort of like uncontrolled. And they felt it was despoiling the landscape. Every once in a while, these studios would explode from fires, So they said, get this out of here. So by 1920, the early 20s, they made it so difficult to work in Fort Lee that they just build studios on the New York side. Now, your other question was, anything still exists? Well, the studios are all gone. I mean, the last surviving studio, it was called the Champion Studio, was on the Englewood Cliffs, Fort Lee border. It had existed until recently, and then the people in Fort Lee said, oh, this is great. This is an empty building. Maybe we can turn it into something. As soon as the landowner heard that, they demolished the building. They flattened it because they were afraid that something was going to happen to it. That was 15 years ago. It's still flattened. There's nothing there. nothing at all there. So that was the last studio building. I think there might be a laboratory building, and there is something called Rambo's Tavern, which was a 19th century stagecoach stop and roadhouse. And that was a site that, filmmakers would arrive and they'd need a place to, dressing rooms, have breakfast or so. So Rambo's would often be used for that. And if you read the autobiographies of like Lillian Gish and Lionel Barrymore, they talk about how everybody would hang out, and that they saved. So you can actually see Rambo's Tavern, which is now, of course, the area surrounding it is completely suburbanized, but that's basically it. That's basically it. So you can I can take people on a walking tour and I'll say, this is where the so-and-so stood. And here's where so-and-so lived, or used to live over here, but there's been a lot of development in Fort Lee in 110 years. So,
Okay, do we have any other questions? And do we have any questions from Zoom? If so, please raise your hand. We have another question here from Jerry.
Thank you. I'm worrying about the future of film. Two variables that seem to be popping their heads up. One is the increase in the demand for film because of things like Netflix, HBO, et cetera, the streaming services. And the other is, on the other side, the possible death of movie theaters. What are the consequences and what are your plans for dealing with these variables?
Well, let Jeremy talk about that first.
It's a good question. And, it's a question that the pandemic and COVID have obviously played a big part because, as we've seen, everything has this window that you used to have between when films would play in the theater and when they would be streaming, all of a sudden got shortened. And now, there used to be rules as to how long a film could play in a theater before it could be on a streaming platform or before we had Netflix out to video or DVD. Now what you're seeing is films are just being released straight streaming, and sometimes they have them in the theater at the same time. But yeah, theaters are closing. Independent theaters in particular, our theater on Cedar Lane is independently owned, and it's one of the few, and he had owned many theaters throughout the tri-state, New York and New Jersey, and effectively had to close them down because wasn't able to cover all the lost costs. So what I would tell people is you need to go to the theater. If you want theaters to be there, you need to support them, because if people don't go to movie theaters, they're not going to be able to survive. And what is happening is, I think theaters won't go away entirely, but you're going to have fewer movie theaters, and you have these big box chains like your AMCs that kind of monopolize it, and you're seeing fewer and fewer independent theaters. And I think it's important, especially when you're a part of a community like Teaneck. Movie theater is an anchor for a community, and it's a place that's very different, a very different experience than going to a shopping mall in Riverside or at Garden State Plaza and being able to go to a restaurant or, have an ice cream at Bischoff's, which is no longer there, but maybe there's a rumor it's coming back, but I don't want to, get into that. But I would just say that things are changing, and there's not a whole lot that we can do other than exhibit and continue to hopefully work with theaters to provide the spaces to do that. But I think it's really incumbent upon the general population to support it, because it's supply and demand. If people are going to just stay home and stream at home, theaters aren't going to make it. So I think you just got to go out and support local cinemas
And go to film festivals also.
and go to film festivals.
Richard, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's turning the theatrical exhibition business, it's turning into a niche business. So, Bruce Goldstein, who runs Film Forum, tells me he's doing better than he was doing before the epidemic. I guess that's true, but that's a very special kind of programming, and he has his own audience. Other people who are running independent theaters, maybe not so much. And the thing to watch is what happens when general public taste sort of, it always goes from genre to genre. Remember, Westerns used to be, and then like nobody wants to see a Western. So what happens when suddenly people get tired of Marvel superhero franchise movies? That's what's keeping those theaters afloat. And if there isn't something else that comes in at that level, you can just sort of kiss those guys goodbye.
We have time for one more question, and we'll take it from Zoom. Peter Rosen, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I wanted to let you know that repurposing theaters was something that I did back in the mid-'80s by hosting artists who wanted to share their work interactively with an audience by projecting slides of their art on the big theater screen and encouraging the audience of fellow creators and the public at large to comment and meet and mingle and get to network and know each other and learn about the creative techniques that these people are presenting from the stage. I thought that might be another way to involve the community and have use of these theaters so that they don't die out and people can be served, artists in particular. What do you think?
That would certainly be a great use, right? I remember when there was that art house on Route 4, which is now Blick, right? Yeah. And my hope was that actually when they went out, that something like that would have happened, but it just wasn't meant to be. Okay.